Привет, меня зовут Дэвид, я работаю в JavaScript и блокчейн, и я хочу сказать о Meteor. And that's all I have in Russian. Been practicing that. Yes, I've been working in Meteor for a number of years. It's a framework that I'm really excited about. Some of you guys might not have heard from Meteor in a while, but it's a cool framework that's really matured over the last few years, so I'm excited to show you guys how you can use it. First, I'll give you a quick background on me. As was mentioned, I used to work for Google in New York City, but for the past few years, I've been freelancing and just traveling around. I'm currently working in blockchain stuff, so if anyone wants to talk with me about that afterwards, I'm always excited to talk about that stuff. And I'm currently working through a company called TopTal for my contract work. So before I get into all the exciting stuff in Meteor, I want to go back a little bit in the history of web application development to my first language, PHP. Any of you guys work with PHP before? Yeah, again, this was my first language I ever programmed in, and I think PHP is really great for first-time developers because PHP, it lets you let someone who knows just HTML write like a little bit of PHP code and integrate that right into their HTML and start from a really small spot in building a web app. I've got some example PHP code here where we have everything from your database connection, your SQL queries, and you've got normal HTML. The code is very tightly bound together. Now, of course, PHP, I think, was created in 1995 at first. This was before JavaScript barely even existed. So back then, creating a web application was entirely server-side code. And over time, JavaScript became more powerful, became faster, and the importance of JavaScript began to grow in building web applications. In the mid-2000s, you would see most web applications would still be mostly back-end code in a language like PHP or Ruby or something, but the amount of JavaScript in the code base would start to grow. But now if you look at modern web development, usually when we build web applications, we're almost building two different projects with two different code bases. We'll have our back-end server in something like Node or any other language that's going to have our database connections, all of our back-end logic. And then our front-end client-side application we kind of view as a separate application itself. Now, there's definitely pros and cons to each. There's definitely a lot of good reasons to separate these code, the front-end and the back-end, but I think we can agree it can get a little bit more complicated. When you're first starting off, it's a lot easier to have one code base, one application, one web app. And that's one of the great places where Meteor comes in. One of the other issues, I think, with modern web development is there's just a lot to do to get a new project up and running. You need your dependencies. You need to install lots of NPM packages. I think lots of boilerplate React projects have like 20 different packages installed. You need to, I always hate setting up Webpack because I think that configuration can be really complicated, and even once you get your configuration ready, you're repeating a lot of the same code in terms of creating a new server and serving your static files and things like that. Once you're done with all that, you will probably have an architecture that looks something like this. You've got your Node, React, Mongo, and you'll see when we create a Meteor application, you're getting almost the exact same architecture. Meteor is entirely built on top of Node. It uses Mongo as its main database engine. It supports a few different view libraries. People who know old Meteor might know that they developed their own view library, but modern Meteor supports React and Angular as well. So you're basically getting all the features of a modern web application. But with Meteor, this all comes out of the box, zero configuration. You install Meteor, and you've got a project like this up and running. So Meteor, as I said, is a full-stack framework. It's going to help you develop your client-side code as well as your back-end code, and it's even going to integrate your database connections. Meteor comes with a CLI tool, kind of like Rails, that'll help you install packages and run dev servers and things like that. And the philosophy of Meteor is, you have JavaScript everywhere, so you can write all the same code, use everywhere, and I put this picture of Steve Jobs because I think building a Meteor application versus building normal React, Node kind of things, to me can kind of feel like buying an Apple product versus Android or something. Meteor just works. You just run it, and you've got an application up and working. You don't have the same level of configurability always, but it just works. So to show this, I'm going to do a quick demo of putting together a web application. I'm going to make a Twitter clone, and if anybody wants to follow along, I'll see if this works or not. If you go to this URL, my dev server should be piped through that. We can see if this works. So the first thing to do to create a new Meteor application is just run meteor create. We're going to pass this React flag. That's going to tell us we want a boilerplate React application. Once we run that, we just enter the directory and just run Meteor, and that'll get a dev server up and running. So I've got my dev server running here. Once you start that server, you get this beautiful looking web page. But we have a server, we have a database running, and we have a client that's got React. It's got some functionality. So we've got an application up and running with just a few commands. What this has given us is a pretty simple folder structure. We have an entry point for our server, an entry point for our client, a little bit of HTML and CSS, and some React JSX files. Just to show all the steps, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I have to install a Babel plugin to get the decorators. A lot of people have been using decorators, and they make your code look a lot nicer. And then I'm going to remove insecure. Now, Meteor is interesting that by default, Meteor projects are insecure. It's an interesting design choice. That means Meteor is going to share all your data with every client and give every client full ability to modify all your data. It's strange, right? But where this would be really useful is when you say you want to make a proof of concept, you want to demo something, or maybe you're just starting a new project and you just want to get some functionality and worry about the security features later. It helps you get your project up and running really quickly. So, and if you do want to secure it, you want to lock it down, it's as easy as just removing a package. So we're going to remove one of these packages to start, and we're going to remove another one of the insecure packages later. Next thing I want to do is just to make things look a little nicer, I'm going to add the Meteor UI library and create some components for that. This is just normal React stuff, nothing Meteor special there. I'll see what that looks like. So I'm going to update the code base, and then the dev server should refresh, and we should get some, let's see, any minute. Oh, there we go. Cool. So we have the same exact website as before, except it looks a little bit nicer now. I think the Wi-Fi is a little slow. So now we're going to get into the fun Meteor magic stuff. We're going to be building a Twitter clone, so we need some user accounts. Users are a built-in function of Meteor. They support lots of different types of user accounts. You have email address and password, or different OAuth providers. So you can log in with Facebook or Twitter or Google. We're going to do a Facebook login. So to set up our server configuration, first we're going to add two new packages. We're going to add accounts Facebook and this configuration package. And then in our server code, we're going to run a little bit of code at startup, which is just going to input our configuration variables. Meteor has a Meteor.settings feature, which is a place that they allow you to support or to put your configuration variables. So I'm going to put my Facebook key and ID in a JSON file, and then when I start the dev server, I just pass that in there. If we run in production, we would pass that JSON string as an environment variable. But this is all we need to do to have our server support Facebook user accounts. On the client, we're going to modify the header component And logging in is as easy as meteor.login with Facebook. Pretty straightforward, so let's see what that looks like. So I'll update the code base here. This is going to, again, the server code will add those packages for Facebook support to store our Facebook accounts on the server, and then our client will add that login with Facebook to this button. I can't tell if it's refreshed yet. Nope. Oh, it's loading. There we go. Now when I click here, oh, live demos are fun. I think it might be slow. There we go. OK, so I click that, and it brings me to the normal Facebook authentication page. And I'm going to click Continue. And now I've logged in with Facebook. Now, we haven't done anything to our UI, so it doesn't show anything. So let's go ahead and add some support for that. What we're going to add to our component is, you can see at the bottom, we're going to wrap our component in a function called with Tracker. Now, this is a function that comes from Meteor, and this kind of lets us import some data from the Meteor ecosystem into our React component. So we're going to run the function meteor.user. That's going to return null if there's no user logged in, or it's going to return an object if there is a user. And that user variable will get passed in as a property to our component. Now, the cool thing about with Tracker is in Meteor supports this idea of reactive functions, which is completely different than React, the framework. Reactive functions allow Meteor to be aware of the value of the function updating over time. That means if the user logs in or logs out, if the value that's returned from that function changes, Meteor will automatically update the property in our component, which means when I switch back over here, you'll see it's put my name. Oh, I missed a step. We're going to check if that user exists, and if it exists, we're going to show the name. If not, we'll show the login button, which is why it now shows my name up there. So we now have user accounts in our project, so now we need to, since this is Twitter, we need to add tweets. I'm going to let the next step load. We need to add a collection to our database now. We're going to create a new Mongo collection called tweets, and we're going to import that in our server code, and we're just going to pre-populate it with a couple sample tweets. The interesting thing about Meteor, though, is this Mongo collection that we've created, that's a valid object on both the client and on the server. If we import that on the server, it's going to behave like a normal Mongo object where you can query it. It's going to connect to our Mongo database and let us query the database. But if we open this on the client, what it's going to have is an in-memory cache of the data. It's going to let us query it and modify it similar to the exact same way we would do it on the server. You can use your Mongo find expressions and even update or delete if you have the permission. But it's the same collection imported on both sides. So for our client code, we're going to create a new component for our feed, and we're going to use that same with tracker that we used before. And in this tracker function, we're going to run tweets.find. Looks like a normal Mongo query. We're going to search for all tweets, sort them by the date it was created, and it will pass those tweets into our component. In our component, we're just going to print each tweet out. So let's see what that looks like. There it is. And you can see I'm going to open a Meteor shell, which is like the node shell, but it lets us interact with a running server. Import that tweets object. So I'm going to insert a new tweet that says, hello everybody, and I'm going to insert that right into our database from this console on the side at the bottom. And you can see right when I inserted that into the server database, our client immediately updated and showed the new tweet. Cool. So we're displaying tweets. The next thing we need is to be able to add new tweets. We're going to create another new component, and this one's going to have a text field and a button, normal kind of component. And in our click handler, we're going to call Meteor.Call. This is Meteor's system for remote procedure calls. When we call Meteor.Call, it's going to call a function called post-tweet on the server and pass our message into it. Now to define that server endpoint, it's this short little bit of code. We're defining a Meteor method called post-tweet. In a Meteor method, we have access to the user ID in the this object. So by checking that user ID is a string and not null, we're just checking that the user is logged in with Meteor's user system. And we're going to insert that tweet into the database. So here's the component we've added, and we can just type a new tweet. And it adds that tweet right in there. So now we've added all the features we need for like a really simple Twitter application. There's one more step we need to do to make this production ready. And as I mentioned earlier, Meteor by default is insecure, and it also will share all data with every client. And as you've seen, that made it really easy to put the features together, to put some functionality together. But we want to make this production ready. We don't want to share all data for security reasons. We also don't want to share all data because obviously a production app wouldn't work if it shared all its data. Imagine if this was real Twitter and your phone loaded every tweet. So we're going to, Meteor uses a PubSub type system, so we're going to create a publication here called recent tweets. And in a publication, we're just going to return a query. Or multiple queries. We're going to return a tweet query where we query the 10 most recent tweets, and we're going to query users where we return just the name and the picture of the user. Now the clients need to subscribe to those publications. So in the tracker function, we're going to call meteor.subscribe, and we're going to subscribe to that recent tweets publication that we've just made. This means when this component is mounted in React, Meteor will start subscribing to that subscription, and when the component is unmounted, it will end that subscription, stop subscribing to that data from the server. We can also check in the tracker if the subscription is ready. If it's not ready, we can pass that as a property into our component and then display loading if it's not ready. And yeah, that's all we really need to make a production app in Meteor. So we're going to go ahead and, we're not actually going to, but we can now build and deploy this app. Meteor has a built-in build system, so it'll create a bundle that we can upload to any server. The only requirements to run it will be a recent version of Node. And there's one more cool thing that Meteor does in this build process. Meteor has Babel built in. I'm sure most of us have worked with Babel. Babel's the project that lets us write cool cutting-edge JavaScript and back compile it to old JavaScript so it can run on any browser. One of the problems is it takes our small, very neat-looking JavaScript there, and it's going to turn it into a really big, messy piece of JavaScript. In this case, it's 12 times as big, the file size between these two bits of code. So all your users, when they're loading Babelized code, have these really big bundles to download. Now, this is especially annoying when most browsers don't need it. As you can see, over 80% of browsers support async await and all the other nice new JavaScript features that we like. So what Meteor does is when you build it, it's going to actually build two different bundles. It's going to build a small bundle that's going to target modern browsers with lots of compatibility, and it's going to build a fatter bundle for older browsers that don't have the same level of compatibility. This way your users don't need to load these really big bundles, but you can still support all major browsers. There's one more cool little feature I just wanted to mention quickly. If we want to turn this web app into a mobile app, we can add a platform, write a config file, and let's see if this loads, and build it right into a Cordova mobile app. Let's see. I don't know if the data's going to load, but yeah, with a few little bits of configuration, you can turn any web app into a mobile app really quickly. There's a couple other features I didn't get to mention here. Dynamic imports work really well in Meteor. It supports server-side rendering since your server has access to your client code. And since we have our server and our client in the same code base, it makes it really easy if we want to have full integration testing. Now, there are a few drawbacks of Meteor, of course. What some people will complain about Meteor is that it does too much, which is a good problem to have, I guess. As you saw, we didn't write any code for our back-end, front-end communication. Meteor takes care of all the communication between the client and the server. So when this works well, it's really easy, but sometimes if these features break, it can be difficult to debug. Meteor uses MongoDB by default, which can be sometimes controversial. If you want to use a SQL database or something like that, you're not going to get really the full Meteor feature set. Meteor can be used in large production-sized applications. There are plenty of big companies that use it, but it is not designed for scalability. Once a project starts to scale up, it can get a little bit difficult. And finally, Meteor's it is a popular framework. It's got lots of contributors, lots of users, lots of big companies, but it's not quite on the same scale as React, which is backed by Facebook, or Angular, which is backed by Google. Now, if you do start building a Meteor application and you decide that you want to move away from it, as I've shown, Meteor's great for starting applications and getting them up and working really quickly. Your Meteor is built on top of really popular web technologies, so it's not that difficult to move away, to take Meteor out of your project. The communication between a client and a server is over a very standardized, pretty simple protocol. So if you want to replace your Meteor server, you can implement this protocol. If you want to build a separate client, or even if you want to build a native mobile app that uses your same database, it's easy to consume that data connection. You can use Apollo. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Apollo, but it's a GraphQL library for client and server, and it's actually built by the Meteor development group, the same company that's building Meteor. And Apollo allows you to get some of these same cool reactivity features with any data source that supports GraphQL. And finally, you can, since we're building everything in React, you can just take your React components and get rid of those with trackers and implement your data connection however you'd like. I've worked with clients who've wanted to do this, who've wanted to take a Meteor application and just turn it into a normal React application, and all the React code pretty much works the same way. You just have to get the data a different way. There's a few alternatives I wanted to mention if you like some of these features but want a different way to access them. Firebase is a popular product from Google. I included Firebase because their user authentication experience, I think, is really easy. If you want to add Facebook user authentication, Firebase makes it very easy to add that, just like Meteor. It offers things like a database and things like that. Next.js is more of a front-end framework, but I think it gives you the same level of zero configuration, zero hassle setup of a new application. But this is just going to let you write a React application with routing and with server-side rendering with no configuration. There's a project called DerbyJS that was the closest I could find in terms of feature set to Meteor. It gives you shared data connection and a database on the back end. It's a full stack framework, and it gives you a little bit more control over your project than Meteor, but I don't think it's quite as popular, has the same level of support. And as I mentioned before, Apollo is a really popular project made by the same company that that supported the Meteor development, and that lets you consume lots of different data connections. So just to wrap up, I think the cases for using Meteor is when you're starting a project, when you want to develop quickly, you want to be able to try out lots of different things and prototype quickly. If you want to take advantage of that live data updating feature, chat applications are a great use case for this. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Rocket Chat. It's basically an open source Slack alternative, and it's built on top of Meteor. Chat apps are great for Meteor because you don't have to worry about polling or setting up your WebSocket. That data updates automatically. And finally, Meteor is great for, say, small to medium scale applications. When you really try to scale a Meteor application to a really large user base, it can be challenging, but I think lots of projects might not need that really large scale user base. And in that case, I think the ease of development of Meteor can outweigh that. And so that's it. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, David. Okay, and let's start with questions. Is it possible to use it with React Native?
Meteor does not support React Native at this time. I think they've said that it's a bit too difficult to integrate. They don't want to try to integrate all the different features from the React Native ecosystem at that time. So for now, they're just focusing on Cordova.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. The next, does it make sense to use Meteor with Redux, or I should store full up state in Meteor?
I think it's often not necessary to use Redux. That with tracker function can take the place of I think the Redux Connect function in many cases. And you can also use, in the presentation I showed how to use that tracker to pull server-side data, but you can do the same thing with data that's just on the client. You can store kind of a local database without updating it. So I think it's often not necessary, but if you do want to use Redux, I don't believe there's anywhere that would conflict with it.
Okay. Is it possible to use Meteor with TypeScript?
With TypeScript, yes, Meteor does support TypeScript natively, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think using TypeScript, Meteor supports. I mentioned different Meteor packages. Some of the Meteor packages add different compile time features, so you can add CSS preprocessors and things like that, as well as JavaScript preprocessors. It still does support CoffeeScript, although it's not nearly as popular anymore. And I believe you can just add Meteor add TypeScript, and it'll give TypeScript support.
Okay. The next one, how to reduce CPU suffering caused by Meteor?
CPU what, sorry?
CPU suffering.
CPU suffering?
Yes.
There's lots of different optimizations. I imagine that might be someone who has used Meteor and knows that Meteor, with lots of data updates, it can become CPU intensive. When you're designing Meteor applications, you can design them with CPU consumption in mind and try to maybe if you're going to be changing something very often, changing your data on the client very often, you might want to cache it on the client instead of writing that to the server too often. I think that's one way. Or just writing publications smartly so that you're not querying too much data. There's a number of different ways to optimize that, I guess.
Okay, going further. Can you tell us about some disadvantages of Meteor?
Yeah, as I mentioned a couple. I think mainly the disadvantages are, it's a very tight ecosystem, Meteor, somewhat. It's built on top of existing technologies, but for data connections, I guess, you're locked in with MongoDB. For communicating between your client and your server, you're kind of using you're forced to follow Meteor's, the way that Meteor defines that communication should be set up a bit. They are, I think, really trying to address this. The way that the Meteor development group, their path that they've seen is with Apollo, with supporting GraphQL, so that you move away from being locked in with just their Mongo database, that you can use any GraphQL database. But yeah, I think being locked into that is what many people will see as a disadvantage.
Okay. And the last one, the bonus question from our Firebase. Is it possible to eject Meteor from the project the same way the Create React app can be ejected?
It is not possible to do that at that time. That would be, I guess, kind of a nice feature to be able to eject that. But as I mentioned before, it's not difficult to take React code out of a React environment to keep your I'm sorry, I keep mixing up React and Meteor. To take your Meteor code out of a Meteor environment, to take your React code and your MongoDB code and things like that, and instead of using the Meteor functions, you would just define maybe express endpoints or something like that. So, but no, there's no feature to eject at this time.
Okay, so thank you for a great speech and for your answers for the questions. Welcome.
Thank you, guys.
So if you